Welcome to the Charlie and Andrei Podcast, another episode about a topic of Neolithic interest, focusing on Göbekli Tepe.
Göbekli Tepe. Yeah.
Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli
No,
Tepe.
Göbekli.
Göbekli Tepe.
It is a mouthful. But yeah, so we're gonna be talking about that and other very ancient kind of Neolithic era cities in the Middle East and Turkey in that area. So I mean what got us kind of interested in this is to get you some background. I guess we've always been fascinated by like ancient cultures, since grade school, since we were kids. The myth of Atlantis and all this stuff. And then we all know about, I guess, ancient Greece, the Babylonians, the Assyrians. Before that, the Egyptians, Sumerians. Sumerians are the ones who have the first written works. Like they're the earliest attested history, so to speak. So I guess that's like about 3500 BC. Anything before that is treated as like prehistory in that, it wasn't recorded. And then we kind of wonder like what came before that? Like those weren't the first towns or cities. Sumer might have been the first civilization, but um, so we went back and then we looked into things like Çatalhöyük and Jericho, which is often cited as one of the oldest cities in the world, as well as, of course, the famous Göbekli Tepe, which goes all the way back to about 12,000 years ago. So almost like 10,000 BC, like 9,500 BC to like 7,000 and something BC. Um,
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned when we were in middle school and high school, whenever I'm sure we could pick up like an old textbook that was printed around that time period, or just thinking about to lectures that our teachers would give us, they'd say like the oldest city back then was Jericho. And I think even Çatalhöyük is a newer idea as well as a newer city. I remember Jericho being mentioned a lot as the oldest city and kind of like, talking about proto cities and these dense Neolithic settlements that would come up. And they'd mention like, I don't know, the Tower of Jericho or something, just some little pre-pottery Neolithic site, as an example of, kind of this city that came about through some sort of agricultural production. And it's interesting, in since the 90s there's been kind of this thing that Göbekli Tepe, which is in southeastern Turkey, modern Turkey, predates those cities, and it predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years, and it predates the Great
Crazy, right?
Pyramids by over 7,000 years.
Yeah.
Um, and it's interesting to consider, was it created by an agricultural society, and that means they lost that technology, and then or that process of agriculture. I wouldn't say like agricultural is necessarily technology, but it's that process of planting things. Or was it created by a hunter-gatherer society? But either one challenges our conventional understanding of societal development, because
Right.
it's either okay, there was agricultural knowledge and then we lost it, or hunter-gatherers actually made cities.
Right, which is actually
Yeah.
a pretty crazy idea if you think about it, because up until now they didn't think that hunter-gatherers could maintain a high enough population density to be able to build a city. Like you would think they would just only have a few, small huts and houses, or just kind of like be nomadic and and kind of constantly be moving with like where the animals and like the fruits are available and
Yeah.
whatnot. But so yeah, it's still uncertain as to whether they had like agriculture or true agriculture, um and even how agriculture first truly started. I mean, what was it, an accident? Was it an intentional process because they had well, here's actually one interesting theory, is that some people say that wine making helped push early agriculture, like the cultivation of grapes, because like that came maybe not quite as early as this, but like in the South Caucasus, like which is not far from this area, you had the earliest wine making like maybe 7,000 BC. Um, so I mean, there's all kinds of ideas for what gave people the push to start, cultivating, planting seeds, and.
Yeah, I mean, and it certainly makes sense because there would be a big incentive for people to plant those things because, hey, look, wine produces this pleasurable sensation in our body, and I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. Maybe it started off as random, they're just like, oh, look, these plants that produce grapes, randomly we're starting to kind of cultivate them. But yeah, you're right. I think like piggybacking off that a little bit, it's interesting because people, at least traditional so far, it's considered that Göbekli Tepe was a pre-agricultural society, but it's suggesting that the construction of this city would have spurned the development of that farming in those surrounding regions and everything. So, and I was reading about Göbekli Tepe, that basically it may not even been a city for residential use because they haven't found a lot of evidence that people were living there, and that they didn't have everyday life there. There wasn't like domestic life and everything going on. There weren't homes. I'm tempted not to believe that because even in Delphi in Greece, like people lived there, right? And it wasn't that they were just hanging around. Like even if you're just the priestly class, like somebody has to be living there. Um, so it is interesting, and it also there's evidence of intentional burial going around there, which is kind of the earliest evidence of human culture that people would put roses and things like that around 8,000 BC, and people preserved structures and carvings. That's just like exceptionally well preserved. So this Göbekli Tepe has really been just revolutionizing archaeology. And that's why I find it fascinating because it's questioning a lot of the paradigms that we have. And in response to this evidence, in true empirical fashion, we have to kind of maybe amend some of our theories.
Right. And thing about Göbekli Tepe is like I think only like maybe 5% of it has actually been excavated so far. So it's really only at the beginning. Like imagine the kind of things that we'll be able to find as they dig deeper. I believe there have been like some challenges, and it's been a slow process since I think the German archaeologist found it in the 90s. Um, but let's see. A lot of those other ancient cities, though, like Çatalhöyük and Jericho, they actually did have known agriculture. So um, I guess Göbekli Tepe was special in that regard. But from what I understand, so like a lot of these early cities had no planning or anything. Like they didn't have like streets or alleys. They were all just kind of a mass of houses and homes that were kind of on top of each other. And sometimes you had to go through another person's home and over like an arch of sorts to get to someone else's. Like it,
Yeah, there
it
was no central planning. Although I
yeah.
guess the question would be how much central planning was there really in Jericho initially? I mean,
Well, yeah, initially, who knows?
yeah, yeah.
But I guess it kind of speaks to almost more, some people assume a more egalitarian society in which it wasn't as stratified into like, say, a priestly
Mm.
caste and like, the commoners and the warriors and the rulers. They're all kind of just in it together, and there weren't any homes that seemed any more special than others. It was very communal, so to speak.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. I mean, I was thinking along the lines that you can sort of draw this fascinating parallel between Göbekli Tepe and other later monumental structures like the Mesopotamian ziggurats,
Yep.
which are just like these loci of ritual. But those came about in an agricultural context. Göbekli Tepe emerges in this what we consider a pre-agricultural context. So it kind of challenges our idea of societal progress and kind of how agricultural processes precipitate kind of that development into, architecture. I mean, the same with cities. Are cities planned from the get go? I guess they have been in the past couple, I guess millennia really, but or do they just happen? You know, um, I think it's a mixture of
It's a
both. I
mix of
mean,
both, of course. I mean, if
yeah,
you look
and
at
there's
like if you look at some of these very old European cities like Rome and Paris and
yeah.
Athens, like they have all these tiny little winding alleys and streets that you can tell were definitely not planned, but that kind of adds, I think, to their charm, right? Like
Oh yeah, no, I
you can take a
totally agree.
scooter, through some tiny little
I was reading
alley.
Joseph Campbell about the design of cities, and he said like he was Jung had talked about how cathedrals were laid out as a mandala, where you kind of have the cross in the middle, and there's these circular things around the cross, and that's how cathedrals are laid out in a very the Gothic cathedrals, at least of Europe, are laid out in a predictable way. And likewise, many cities in Europe, yes, they started off as windy, but they tried to maintain that mandala format later on in time. And Joseph Campbell says that DC was like a mandala laid out very deliberately by Lafont and everything. Um, but I think it's this attempt, Göbekli Tepe. It's an attempt to like impose order on chaos in a way. It's not just like a pile of rocks. It's all these symbolic structures of like the earliest attempts of humans to engage and wrestle with the infinite. Um, and it's an incredible, interesting insight into the foundation of a society because they were united by something, sort of this transcendent or like a narrative or like of a higher order. But it's also a profound lesson because uh that society ended. Whether you agree that it was pre-agricultural or it was a hunter society, it collapsed into chaos. And um it shows this really interesting fascination with the sacred that just didn't last. Whether you believe that the agricultural processes existed or it was hunter gatherers, both those collapse, and it's kind of a message to people in modern society as well. So I think like that's what's fascinating about the Göbekli Tepe, because Çatalhöyük, I think, kind of reinforces okay, Jericho type cities and all that, agricultural revolution, things like that, dense population centers. But this challenges our whole paradigm of archaeology and how society progresses.
Yeah, and there have been a lot of theories for sure put in place by this. Some controversial, some less. I guess Graham Hancock is one of the more prominent voices that talks about this. But yeah, well, we don't think it was. This probably wasn't aliens or anything like that. But it is a testament to the uh, the ingenuity of mankind, even in that very ancient era, to be
Yeah,
able to.
I think for I don't know exactly how to take it, but a lot of scientists don't take a lot of what he says as serious. But I mean, he does talk about it and he does popularize it, which I think is kind of a good thing.
Right.
Um, I think so I mean he's sort of the idea that this agriculture, yeah, and of course we don't think aliens gave this agricultural process, but he's of the opinion that they had these agricultural they already had the agricultural revolution, and then the younger dryas period, which is kind of this period of sudden catastrophic climate change occurs, and then the survivors of that global cataclysm weren't able to preserve that wisdom or that agricultural revolution from that sort of golden age, and so that's where we're sort of investigating into what's been lost. Um, and I mean it's an interesting testament. I mean there's a lot to be said about why people were being deliberately buried there. um I mean Graham Hancock, he would say, well, they were preparing for this the end of the world, this massive cataclysm. I don't know if they could have predicted that, but it is interesting to consider that they could have predicted that, maybe through like astronomical alignments, not necessarily like astrology, but maybe they were like like the weather alignments. Maybe they were able to predict the weather in some sort of way, and they kind of had this sophisticated idea of the cosmos. I mean, even in Plato's Republic, you have a mention, which I think is the first mention of Atlantis. And there's many theories of like Atlantis
Yep.
existing in the Western Sahara or something. But I mean, Atlantis could just be a myth for interpreting human society and society falling apart. But I mean, it could be that Göbekli Tepe was a network of ancient sites, much like the stone like henge sites, millennia later, right? Thousands of years later, but all these megalithic structures could have been a network of sites and representative of that time period in the zeitgeist that existed back then.
It's certainly evidence of cultural diffusion and transmission for sure. The megalith builders. And that's another like fascinating topic that Stonehenge. Um, we can maybe get to that on a different occasion. But yeah, it so like what there was like the last glacial cycle I think occurred around the time of Göbekli Tepe, right? Like
Or right
the
after it, yeah,
final,
yeah,
yeah, bit of the ice
or
age.
precipitated the end of it too.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And do you think that like impacted or affected like the fact that they might have lost their agricultural knowledge and people had to sort of independently develop it again?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, that Younger Dryas period, which is kind of like that 12,900, 11,700 years ago, it's just this massive return of glacial conditions all around the world. And it ends with the gradual warming of the last ice age. But temperatures in the northern hemisphere, definitely there's geological evidence that they became much colder. It lasted like 1,200 years. I mean, you and I were talking about there are technologies that are just lost. I mean, the Byzantines had Greek fire, whatever that was. I imagine it was similar to napalm. uh or the battle of the Black Gulf from Game of Thrones, I mean,
Yeah,
that
it was
massive
ahead of
fire.
its time. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of hypotheses out there about the causes of it. It could have been volcanic activity. It could have been comet impact, right? Um, and I think it was a transitional period because whether they had that process of agricultural knowledge that forced those hunter communities, maybe they lost it, but maybe they were also first forced to innovate it, because I think that's the theory. They're like, oh crap, we can't just, not everything is given to us. We have to innovate, and that leads to the groundwork for the agricultural revolution and settled life.
Right, being able to plant cultivars or variants of plants that are hardier and more able to withstand, a different climatic pressures. Uh, I mean, the whole idea of like taking wild grains and cultivating them to make them suitable for human use is actually pretty fascinating. If you think about
Yeah.
it. And people have actually been eating like grains apparently since as far back as like 100,000 years ago. But of course, domestication and cultivation only happened around 10,000 years ago. Or I
Yeah.
guess 12,000. But um, yeah, I mean, so you have examples of things like this kind of happened independently in Mesoamerica, but like the wild ancestor of the corn that we know today, like or I guess maize as it's called in a lot of other places. It was actually a very small plant where the edible part was like like only a couple of inches long. I think it was called teosinte, and a
Oh,
lot of those
interesting.
early Mesoamericans selectively bred it to the point where it became this nice, juicy yellow corn that we, enjoy
Mm, I
and
know.
probably put too much of in everything we eat today,
Yeah,
like
that's
high
true.
fructose corn syrup. But that's a whole nother, discussion.
It's funny
But
you mentioned that. I've read that there is geological evidence that fauna and even megaflora species died out during that. I mean, like, the mammoths and things like that.
You
They
mean
weren't
in
as.
the Americas, right? Like
Yeah, yeah. No, but
that
I
was,
mean,
yeah.
mega flora, like bigger plants were available for
Okay,
humans to
yeah.
eat. And so they had to like cultivate, which grain is small, right? So you have to kind of like hustle to, but the mastodons, the saber-toothed cats, right? Which I understand are primarily in North America. But those megafauna species just like died out. Maybe as a matter of overhunting, right? Which we've
Right,
seen
yeah,
that
that's the
when we
theory.
were
And
kids.
you know, like the mammoths, there was an actual indigenous variety of horse in the Americas that was hunted for meat. They didn't really think to try to tame and ride them.
Yeah.
Um,
And there were giant sloths. There were those like
right.
bears, the American lions, right? There, I
Yep.
think there were giant beavers as well, and
Uh-oh.
they vanished during
That
that
sounds
period.
scary.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's scary, but also, I don't, I guess, useful for the humans living at that time period.
Oh yeah.
But I mean, there was a major disruption in the ecosystem. I mean, especially with the mammoths and the mastodons being because they maintained the grasslands, right? And they trampled a lot of that vegetation, and those large predators also regulated like their prey populations, and that leads to a massive ecological shift because they're no longer maintaining the grasslands and they're no longer maintaining the grazing and the vegetation. So with the loss of those megafauna, early humans society have to adapt to that change in the ecological system as well. So they have to go to smaller game, they have to do plant gathering, and eventually, which is what we consider agriculture.
Yeah, it's probably a complicated set of cause and effect kind of, like humans have a habit of disturbing the environment and ecosystem wherever they go, intentionally or not. And sometimes that causes more problems for them, which they have to adapt to and adjust to, and that can lead to obviously in this case very uh, vital and crucial and discoveries for the whole rest of our species. Because I mean, the agricultural revolution is what basically set everything else off, of course.
Oh
But
yeah, I mean,
interestingly, though, it was independently arrived in several places
yes,
because
yes,
it was also developed in China, I believe, a little bit after the Fertile Crescent, and then later in Central America.
yep.
Um,
And also in modern Peru, I think it's considered in no, Chile, and maybe Argentina. And there's a new theory that New Guinea actually independently
huh.
invented agriculture as well, or the processes for agriculture, which are really fascinating. It's interesting. People used to think that the Mediterranean basin invented it independently, but that is no longer considered as a center of origin. So, I mean, that's interesting for agricultural as well.
Yeah, no, so what happened was as far as we know, the earliest agriculture did start in the Near East, the Fertile Crescent, if you will.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of these very ancient cities that we're talking about, like Göbekli Tepe, Çatalhöyük, Jericho, and so on, they're all kind of in that Turkey and Levant area. And then, of course, you saw actual civilization blossoming in Sumeria and Mesopotamia nearby. It's no coincidence. And then that agriculture there actually spread via Anatolia westward into the Mediterranean, so like Greece in the
Yep.
Neolithic era. And then this population of Neolithic farmers actually kept spreading westward into to Italy and then Iberia and so on. Um, Whereas I think the Northern Europeans at the time did not actually practice agriculture for a while. They were mostly hunter-gatherers still. Um,
Well, I mean, a lot of Northern Europe, I mean, depending on which part you're talking about, is just inherently not, it doesn't have good quality for agricultural performance. And the suitability, I mean, of the Nordic countries is the suitability for agriculture there is very low unless you're in the southern parts of the country. Uh, And I mean, but it's also it's a combination. It's a ratio of soil performance and soil resilience, right? So I mean, I think the soil is very resilient in the northern countries. It's just it doesn't always perform that well, So
Yeah, as the
yeah,
Irish learned firsthand during the potato
yes,
famine. Well, that was partly for other reasons, but
yeah, yeah. Well, that we could do a whole podcast on that. That would be fascinating because there is something to be said about, from an anthropological perspective, the Irish farms, regardless of whether you talk about management and everything, they were all unified and they basically had the same DNA sequence, was in what later interpreted to be the same genetic stock of all the grain and or the potatoes that were being produced. I mean, so if one potato farm failed, that means all of them would fail because there was no diversity
yeah,
in potato sequencing, because they were basically all genetically the same or similar potato farms because they were all unified. So that's that, from an anthropological perspective, it shows that if a system doesn't have any diversity, then things will fall apart quickly, because if one part falls apart, it all falls apart.
that's true. You have basically like a single point of failure in some ways.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and that goes for a lot of things, for even animal breeding and whatnot.
Well, yeah, I mean, if like all if you're raising a bunch of cows or something, or livestock, and they're all basically genetically similar, there's no diversity. If one disease kills them and they're all sort of in contact with each other, then the likelihood they're all going to die is very high.
Yeah. Very
Same with
true.
any type of livestock, fish. It could happen in forests, right? If like a fungus is or like a virus is affecting a forest, fishing populations. Same with agricultural
Yeah.
production. Yeah.
Don't even get me started on like how people have bred dogs that are so unhealthy and some of the more purebred breeds, but
Oh, it's very sad. Yeah,
yeah.
it's very sad. I love a lot of those dogs, and I feel sad for them. But yeah,
Yeah. Um, but that would be another interesting topic, the domestication of dogs, and how that was turned from the wolf into what we know
yes,
today
that
as
would
the
be
domesticated
fascinating
animal.
as well. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that reflects on the human condition as well.
Yep.
Yeah,
And then comparing that to maybe like cats, which were uh, kind of domesticated in a different way entirely.
yeah, yeah. But in a similar way, Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I mean, I,
yeah.
I guess we can just kind of even talk about it here, since we are talking about stuff that happened in that era. But basically, we domesticated dogs by selecting the ones that were the most docile and friendly to humans, while cats, they kind of domesticated themselves because they just kind of benefited from being able to hunt mice and things like that, and other uh, pests and vermin in our vicinity, which is why they take a very different attitude toward humans. But
Yeah. No, I hear you. I mean, it's interesting why cats can sometimes have personalities, but I mean, it's all part of the human story about like how we interacted with people, and how all these dynamics just sort of interplayed with each other. I mean, yeah, I mean, the development of cats, of dogs, it's all a representation of kind of this shifts in human behavior that might have been precipitated by either ecological or human, but either way it kind of reverts. So like if there's massive climate change due to an ice age and temperatures fall, then other fauna die, or maybe humans hunt them, but then the humans have to figure something out because it's a chain
yep,
reaction.
yep,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, the horse of all the domestications was probably the most game changing, so to speak. I mean, the fact that people got the idea of getting on top of these animals as they galloped across the plains or steppes. I mean, that's
And I think we touched on that with how the Indo-Europeans were able to make that pivot and that pivotal change.
they were not the very first, but they were close after, and they took advantage of a lot of relatively recently developed technologies like horse domestication and copper and metallurgy, and kind of made them better for their own purposes, and that kind of enabled them to really take off and spread all over the place, the chariot.
Yeah, I mean, they were able to, it seemed like they had mastered the chariot, they had mastered the horse. I think they had even made some, linguistic innovations at the time. And then they were also, I think they made innovations with herding cows and breeding cows. And if
Right.
all that happens at once, you basically have the nuclear power of your age,
Yep.
which is what led to the subsequent civilizations of
Yeah.
Indo-Europeans like the Scythians and, you know.
Everything else. I mean, it's just fascinating that it wasn't. This is all before it was recorded in writing. So we can
Yes.
only infer it through
Yes.
archaeological,
Well, yeah,
and genetic and
archaeological.
linguistic data. There's like
Yeah.
a lot of fields that kind of had to come together to make this all makes sense. Which is
Yeah.
why this whole topic is very, I think, in my opinion, very useful and fascinating.
Oh, it is fascinating because you can use these logical puzzles to solve the problems of the world. I mean, yeah, I mean Latin, like you said, the equus is horse, hippos is horse in Greek, and then you can sort of you look at Old English and Sanskrit, and you can sort of try to reproduce the Proto-Indo-European word. It was like equos or something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, for horse,
Some
which is
change
really
more
cool.
than others. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which is really
Is it?
cool how you can do that.
Yeah. They don't know the linguistic or cultural affinity of things like Göbekli Tepe because it was too far back and we don't really have too much other evidence other than the fact that we know how their houses were kind of put together. So we can assume like not as much stratification socially as we mentioned before. But hopefully they'll be able to uncover more about it as they kind of dig deeper.
It would be amazing. I mean, there is no evidence of written. No humans had sort of developed written language at that time period, and so communication was entirely oral.
Yeah.
Um, Probably for day to day interactions or maybe a ceremony or something. So it could have been proto Euphratean family, could have been a proto Hurrian family, or maybe it was a proto Afro-Asiatic
Yeah.
family, or maybe it's probably a stretch to say Proto-Indo-European.
Yeah, I doubt that, but yeah,
Maybe an Anatolian language, like
yeah. I mean, that's a whole other thing. That's a whole other
The
topic. But
Hittites and the Luwians were
yeah,
there later on, but
the Caucasus is just a fascinating area because this is not far from that area, and I got the
yes.
chance to go there in Georgia to actually see the landscape, and it really is one of the most ancient continuous cultures in the world. Um,
Yeah, Georgia and Armenia, truly,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I
So,
mean, they're true treasure troves, and I hope that they continue to maintain the study of their languages, as much as possible.
yep, agreed. But any other thoughts on these ancient proto kind of cities? And I guess we can talk about how like some of them I'm not so sure about Göbekli Tepe in particular yet, but Jericho in particular had many layers of
Yes.
habitation, so they built a city that kind of declined over time. The others they built on top of it, and then again and again. And you see that happening in like Troy, for example. I think the Trojan War was like what Troy 6 or something.
Yeah, yeah, many layers to Troy. Yeah, I think I read that there's layers to Göbekli Tepe, and I mean there's probably layers to Rome, Athens, Jerusalem. I mean any city really that you think about.
I think you were saying that like Athens, like in the Olympic Park area, like has been inhabited continuously by some people since like the kind of Neolithic, right?
I think there's evidence that it was. Yeah, yeah. I mean it's much less evidence than there is of like the golden age of Athens, of course. But I mean, yeah. I mean, Athens. I think it's Herodotus who points out Athens is nicely situated because it's not really good agriculturally, but it's okay. And it kind of has a natural
Right.
defensive position because if it was really rich and agricultural, like if it was just lush and fertile, then it wouldn't last because everybody would want it.
Everybody wanted, yep.
And but since it's not that great, but it's like kind of okay, it's decent. And then it just has a natural defensive being in that peninsula, and then they have those nice hills that lead to natural defense as well. So Athens is just like Jerusalem. It's situated in a defensive position.
Yeah. And so some of these areas were subjected to a lot of warfare later in history, of course, like, Jerusalem and all that. But one kind of wonders what like warfare and human conflict looked like in the age of like Göbekli Tepe, if that was a thing, if they had like armies coming at each other. I think because like the earliest battle goes back to like maybe 1400 BC, which is like the Egyptians and the Hittites. So they don't really have too much evidence of earlier. I guess there's some
Yeah.
archaeological evidence, but
Yeah. And I think even the earliest Troy, like of those levels of Troy that you mentioned, I don't think they would really overlap.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they would just go back to like 3000 BC or something. But
Um,
so, I mean, I would think like maybe, I don't know. I mean, the battles might be low in numbers and just people unorganized, not really in like lines or anything. They're just kind of attacking each other. Maybe it's just like big bandit groups.
yeah,
Uh, yeah,
I could see that, like raiding and things like that.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, Troy is like very much a Bronze Age type of society.
Yeah, which
All the
is a good
Troys.
bit later. Yeah,
Yeah. Um, I mean, the Hittites in the I think in the 14th and 13th centuries they mentioned Wilusa, right?
that's right. Yeah, that was
Yeah,
I thought that was
and they
Troy.
say
Yeah,
like maybe that they signed a treaty and Wilusa might correspond to Homeric
yeah,
Troy. Uh,
Ilias, Ilium.
yeah.
Yeah. So
So who knows?
a lot of unresolved mysteries, and as I was saying, there's a lot of unresolved mysteries that many of which may never actually really come to light, unfortunately. I'm sure there will be tons of more fascinating archaeological discoveries, but there are some things that we might just need to be content with leaving a mystery, unfortunately. But hopefully, some more light can be shed on the mystery of Göbekli Tepe and all these ancient cities. Do you have any other final words to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on a lot of cool stuff that, Göbekli Tepe is known. I mean, just kind of that it's located in this region that's just fascinating. But what's interesting is its temporal dimensions, where, it's over 11,000 years old. It predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. It predates the Great Pyramids by like 7,000 years. I mean, it's just a fascinating insight into the human story, and that it's not always linear, but it's kind of cyclical at times. I think there's this quote from T.S. Eliot: "We shall not cease from exploration," and I guess that's in line exactly with what you said. That we're going to keep looking into Göbekli Tepe as humans, and it sort of echoes ideas of just spirituality, a societal progression, and it converges in anthropology, archaeology, and even potentially the other sciences of ecosystems, agriculture, and cognitive sciences.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, that about wraps up this episode, guys.
Thanksgiving special.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanksgiving.
So
I
don't
mean,
forget to like, comment,
it's a good
subscribe.
topic for Thanksgiving since it's like the origin of agriculture. We wouldn't have any of this if it wasn't for those brave
Yeah.
pioneers
That's
at
the animal we
Göbekli
didn't
Tepe.
talk about. We didn't talk about the turkey.
Yeah, that kind of
But we
turkey.
did mention the country of Turkey,
Yeah,
so
so
it's
close enough. But
yeah, yeah.
anyway, guys, till next time,
Till next
signing
time.
off.
Signing off.